Thank you for coming, whether you're here in person or live streaming. A hearty welcome from the Church of Christ here. I'm Chris Wright, one of the members, and we are studying the book of Isaiah. Gary, can you switch to the PowerPoint for Isaiah? I know y'all want to talk about donuts, but not yet. Not yet. Yeah, okay, Isaiah. We're going to attempt to cover chapters 10 through 14 concerning prophecies of Judah and Jerusalem. There's not a Jerusalem 2. That's actually the second lesson entitled that. So just in case you're thinking, where's Jerusalem 2 on the map? Okay. Okay, just a quick review. We covered sort of the first 9 chapters of Isaiah. And in that we saw that the people of God had rebelled. The rulers rebelled, and as a result, they end up with a wicked nation. So let me ask you, are you following God? How very strange and sad that the Lord's people refuse to heed the prophet's message. And we're looking back 750 roughly BC and thinking, yeah, that's 2,800 years ago roughly. Thinking, yeah, that's pretty sad. But how about us today? Are we heeding the prophet's word? Just a second review point is that God has a universal reign. In other words, he is king of everything and everyone. Now, not everyone's willing to bow the knee and make that good confession at this point, but they will. But they will. In fact, that's one of the verses coming up in Isaiah 45. Every knee shall bow, and every tongue shall confess. And in his universal reign, he will punish his adversaries. We talked about enemies of the Lamb in a class on Revelation maybe last summer. I think it was last summer. And just briefly, there was 7 classes. Anyways, we won't go into all that. 7 types of enemies of God. So there's numerous. But the third thing I just want to just touch on is that in the first 10 chapters, there's a remnant. God always has a remnant preserved, and he has promises that apply to those who are faithful. So that's worked into all throughout Isaiah. I just wanted to remind you that before we... Okay, take a look at this. This is an overview of the whole book. There's 66 chapters divided into different sections. It talks about the topics, the place, the time, the author. The author is all the same. It's the prophet Isaiah. The time frame is about a 40-year period from 722 to 681 BC. And so far we've been talking, the prophet's been addressing Judah and her neighbors who were heathen to the core. The sermons have been about mostly condemnation for violation of God's universal law. And they come in the form of visions and burdens. So we're in that area. I've circled it. You see the circle. It's in red, but it doesn't show up real well, but you see the circle. Just to give you a framework of where we are. So let's look at chapter 10 as we start with the text this morning. It opens up with a short blast aimed at the corrupt leaders of the nation. The judicial rulers were writing laws that were unjust. The legal system was ignoring the rights of the poor and widows. Here's an excerpt from it, verse 1 and 2. Woe to those who enact evil statutes and to those who constantly record unjust decisions. Sounds a little familiar to contemporary world we live in. So as to deprive the needy of justice and to rob the poor of my people of their rights, so that their widows may be Maybe they're spoiled, and then they plunder the orphans. In the principle with reaping and sowing, what these evil rulers, what would they do on the day of God's visitation? You know what the day of visitation means, like the day of judgment. You're going to have to answer the day of visitation. What would they do? In the text, it's going to tell us that God's day of visitation would come upon them from afar, from far away. Whom would help them? Their glory, riches stolen from the oppressed. Who would that go to? That would go to others. And they would either be slain or become prisoners. All this by the hand of God himself because of their rebellion, which we talked about earlier. Yeah, there's a map. Okay, we're still in chapter 10. On the right, we have a map of the Assyrian Empire. The purple is where it started, and it expanded the green area, and then down to the brown, down at the tip, which would be toward the left-hand side. That's where you see Judah. But that's the Assyrian Empire, just to give you some background. One of the great biblical narratives revealing the Creator's use of providential might in national affairs. You see, Assyria is given success in their expansion, their brutal military expansion, by the hand of God. He uses them as his instrument of correction for his rebellious children. Yet the king of Assyria was haughty. He had arrogant pride. Sennacherib's boast in chapter 37 was his undoing. We'll look at that later, but he boasts outside the walls of Jerusalem, claiming that no one could save them from his hand. Everyone else who had tried, their gods all fell. They were inferior. And the same thing would happen to Jerusalem and God's people. That's what he said. But that actually was his undoing, his great pride. All nations desperately need to learn about that arrogant, boastful pride. The time is coming when both Israel and Judah would learn not to trust. It would not be wise to trust in human political power. It always ends badly. And also in verse 21 of chapter 10, it does mention again, a remnant will return to the mighty God, El Gibor, the mighty God. Sometimes, there we are. Get this coordinated here. Okay, chapter 11. This is really a bright spot. This is a section of comfort that's surrounded by really sermons of condemnation for rebellion. But in chapter 11, we have the introduction of the branch, which is standing for Christ, the Messiah's coming kingdom. It speaks about the traits of this king and judge and how different they are from worldly human kings and so forth. They actually judge with fairness, not with prejudice, not with selfish motives, but in complete fairness. Let's see. Assyria, let's wait on that. This king that's coming would have all wisdom and understanding, divine counsel to humanity. We looked at that, in fact, from Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6. It's talking about the coming of the Messiah. And it calls him Counselor, Mighty God, different titles for the coming Messiah. It also speaks of the coming king's power, knowledge, and fear of God that are his companions. Okay, so what we have here in chapter 11 is a prophecy that says, number one, Assyria will be cut down with no hope of renewal. That's Judah's oppressor, Israel's oppressor. Israel will have a fruitful shoot from the stock of Jesse, David's father, David of the Bible, the great King David, his father Jesse. Namely, the Messiah would be the shoot that it's referring to. Fulfillment of this prophecy, however, requires genealogical records. You have to be able to trace it back for fulfillment. So prima facie evidence against those still waiting for his first coming is that he's already come, because all the records, all the genealogical records were destroyed in 70 AD. There's not one left. In fact, for our Jewish brethren to this day, if you ask them what tribe they're from, they really don't know, because all the records were destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. Come to think of it, I'm not really sure how they even know they're a Jew. No records. But what I want to point out is that the fruitful vine, the offshoot of Jesse, David, so forth, that's the Messianic line, and that all came about before those records were destroyed. So it could be traced and verified and looked at the prophecy and see how that was fulfilled. Let me see if I can do one little thing here. I got a note that has swirled its way down. There it is. There's one other point I wanted to make, and that is that premillennialists, I can't say it, premillennialists believe that Christ is going to come back and reign on the earth for a literal 1,000 years. I don't think this is the case. In order to hold that position, you really have to ignore what the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans. In his passage about the gospel age, he refers back to this event and ties it in with it in Romans chapter 15. So I don't think that's something we're going to spend a lot of time on, but oh no. There it was. There. And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people. To it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. In that day, what day is he talking about? Well, the day he had just spoken of, it's the Christian dispensation. In that day, that's what that's talking about. Christ would function as a rallying banner. He calls it an ensign in this translation, a banner in some other translations. And unto him the Gentiles would seek glorious rest. You remember Jesus' statement in Matthew 11, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And it does mention a rest right there in verse 10 of Isaiah 11. But with righteousness he will judge the poor, and decide with fairness the afflicted of the earth. And he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. The Messianic kingdom will be a reign of peace among those who seek refuge in him. Graphic symbols are employed here. In chapter 11, it talks about natural creatures that are enemies. The lion and the lamb, he says they're going to lay down, they're going to live in harmony, they're going to live at peace with one another, which you go, well, that's an odd thing. It is. But it's symbolic, okay? It's symbolic. If you look at Ephesians chapter 2, it talks about Christ coming and breaking down the enmity between, it's talking about, I think, two things. First, between Jew and Gentile, making peace. Also, the enmity between God and man. Okay, also, that wall of partition that divides them has been broken down so that there can be peace between the two groups, which before this, that was a rather unnatural thing, that Jew and Gentile would be anything but enemies. You remember the map we showed, and you've got the Promised Land, Judah and Israel, the northern and southern kingdoms. Who are they surrounded by? Everybody who surrounds them. Any friends? No, not one. No, not one. They're all enemies, long-term enemies of the people of God and of God. A number of them are some of their distant relatives, Lot and his offspring and so forth, Esau, some names like that. Those are some of the ones that surround them, but there's others who are just enemies. They're just enemies. But in the Messianic kingdom, the two can be joined together. And I think that's really what it's talking about. So let's see. Isaiah is showing the power of the gospel to change men's hearts as they come to God's holy mountain, which is, in verse 9, it's the kingdom of Christ. Further, the gospel of Christ will flow throughout the entire earth. That's prophesied in Habakkuk. It's confirmed in Luke. It's confirmed in Acts. Any claim that this prophecy has never been fulfilled, it can be eloquently refuted by the testimony of the New Testament. So this is a prophecy that's already been fulfilled in the Messiah's kingdom. Chapter 12, it's a short, I think it's 6 verse, but it's really a psalm of praise, giving glory to God. God provides the water. Often God will use fresh water as a symbol of salvation. Fresh water is required for life, you know that. Okay, water, but if it's salty, what happens if you drink salty water? It's no good, is it? You just get thirstier. If you're out at sea and you drink salt water, it's not going to help. You're going to die of thirst anyways. Probably sooner than later, rather than later. So fresh water is essential. So when he talks about water, water is life-giving. Jesus talked about those who believe streams of living water would flow out of the believer. Okay? God provides the water, but man must draw it out. Man must draw it out. Okay, this chapter 12, it's celebrating the joys and glories of the gospel age. The analogy to the Hebrews was the deliverance from Egyptian slavery. Well, under the Messianic kingdom, what are we delivered from the slavery of? The slavery of sin and death. Okay? That's our two big problems, are sin and death. And yes, they're interlinked. And the gospel, the Messianic kingdom, solves both of those problems. It's the only thing that addresses either one of those problems, and it solves both. Incidentally, there's no other system in the world that can do either one of those things. So the gospel is truly unique in its life-giving ability. Chapter 12, the third point I want to bring out, the New Israel, often called Zion, has redemption in the kingdom of Christ. Salvation is represented as fresh water from a well. It requires a human response in drawing it out. There are two responses after receiving salvation that it just absolutely invokes. One is rejoicing, and the other is the desire to tell others of the glad news. That is the missionary thrust of the New Testament, isn't it? There you have it. Proper emphasis of evangelistic zeal should be a proclamation of the mighty deeds of Jehovah, which in the inhabitants of Zion they should shout to the whole earth. So that's chapter 12. It's only 6 verses. So we got one slide for it. Okay, chapter 13. Chapter 13 is longer, but it's pretty easy to understand, really. It contains an oracle against Babylon, which Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw in the first verse in chapter 13. And here I've got it printed up there on the screen. I'm not sure if you can see it, read it from the back. It's probably like me trying to read it from the back, a little difficult. So I'll share it with you. I have commanded my consecrated ones. I have even called my mighty warriors, my proudly exalted ones, to execute my anger. You know how we talked about the first lesson that said when you read Isaiah, sometimes it's difficult to figure out who's speaking and who's he speaking to. Okay, Isaiah is speaking on the Lord's behalf. Okay, so he's speaking, this is the Lord speaking, and he's talking about he's going to execute his anger. What's he angry about? His own people's rebellion against him. They violated his commandments. They picked up idols. They're doing all manner of mischief is going on. The leaders are corrupt, and he's had enough. So he says, a sound of a tumult on the mountains, like that of many people, a sound of the uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts is mustering the army for battle. The Lord is summoning his battle axe. It's Assyria. It's Babylon. He uses both. They are coming from a far country, from the furthest horizons, the Lord and his instrument of indignation to destroy the whole land. Well, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. Over on the right-hand side, I have a picture, if you will, of Daniel's vision from Daniel chapter 2, where he had this dream, he interprets it. Anyways, it's a statue with these different parts to it. The head of gold is the Assyrio-Babylon kingdom. It's represented, it's called a lion. The head of gold is a lion. The breast and the arms are of silver. That's the Medo-Persian kingdom. That's the two we're going to be dealing with in this section, and that one's called the bear. But the third one down is the Greeks, represented as a leopard and belly and thighs of brass. So you've got this statue and this string. So this oracle against Babylon and Isaiah ties directly into what Daniel speaks of. And I always like maps, graphs, pictures. Let's see if we can get this to, yeah, okay. Judgment on the day of the Lord. Again, chapter 13 continues. Darkness, whenever the Bible talks about darkness, it symbolizes coming judgment. And I like the picture I found on it. What do you think when you see that picture? What do you think? What's coming? A storm. Who said a storm? That's it. It's a storm, isn't it? You better take shelter. You better get ready to find some safe place because a storm is coming. A bad storm. Okay? Okay. Let's see. Okay. Still in chapter 13, the presence of Almighty and the expression of his wrath. Wrath. What's wrath? What? Anger. Wrath's not a good thing, is it? Something bad about to happen, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Any of y'all have parents that occasionally you felt like their wrath was directed toward you when you were younger? Not a good feeling, is it? Impending doom. Wrath. Okay. The Lord reigns. I just love this picture with lightning. Here's what Isaiah 13:13 says. Therefore, I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken from its place at the fury of the Lord of hosts in the day of his burning anger. Better take cover. Whoops, too late. Whoops, too late. There's a verse over in Psalms, David's Psalms, chapter 97, the first 6 verses that are just eloquent, that describe a similar type thing that I just want to share with you. The Lord reigns, let the earth rejoice. Let the many isles be glad. Clouds and thick darkness surround him, and righteousness and justice are the foundations of his throne. Fire goes before him and burns up his adversaries round about. His lightnings lit up the world. The earth saw and trembled. The mountains melt like wax at the presence of the Lord. At the presence of the Lord, the whole earth, the heavens declare his righteousness, and all peoples have seen his glory. That's all inspiring to me. It's like, well, it kind of ties to this Isaiah 13:13, same type of idea, principle here. All right, Isaiah 13, verses 14 through 18. A couple of maps here. The one on the right is the macro map. The idea in this chapter is that Babylon will fall to the Medes. And this is predicted in advance of it happening. In fact, later on in the book of Isaiah, he's going to actually call out by name the leader of the Medo-Persians, a man named Cyrus, 150 years before it happens, which means, how old was Cyrus when this happened, when this prophecy was made? He wasn't born yet. Okay? And Isaiah is specifically naming him. In fact, that's one of the reasons the liberals say Isaiah couldn't have written Isaiah, all of it, because the prophecies are, get this, too accurate. It must have been too hard for God, I bet, huh? You know that was an understatement, a facetious understatement, don't you? If God can speak the world into existence out of nothing, just by the pure power of his word, how is it that he couldn't do this? Where's your faith? It's just, to me, it's pretty absurd. Okay, the map on your left is a close-up. And I want to show you. First, you see the Tigris and Euphrates River. Remember, that's the cradle of civilization, right? In between there. Well, right in about the middle of that, you see this place called Baghdad in current-day Iraq. 50 miles south of that is where Babylon was. Because, as the prophecy says, we're going to see in a minute, Babylon is no more. What's 50 miles south of Baghdad today are the ruins of ancient Babylon. I just wanted to mention about the Medes from chapter 13. There's a graphic description that leads no other conclusion except they were ruthless and cruel, as denoted by anyone found was thrust through in verse 15, and little ones were dashed to pieces, houses plundered, wives ravished, verse 16. And it goes on. It's horrific. All right. Okay, the photograph on the right. Let's read this. Let's read this first. Babylon to fall from the left. This is Isaiah 13, verses 19 and 20. And Babylon, the beauty of the kingdoms and the glory of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited nor lived in from generation to generation, nor will Arab pitch his tent there, nor will shepherds make their flocks lie down there. What we have on the right is a photograph. A man named Henry Layard excavated this area 50 miles south of Baghdad in 1845 to 1851. So you're talking about maybe 6 years of excavation. And what he discovered there, 50 miles south of Baghdad, was the ancient ruins of Babylon. And he described it as a naked and hideous waste. A naked and hideous waste. However, the fall of Babylon accomplished the release of Judah from captivity. Because Cyrus, the Medes come in, and after a while, the Israelites get to return back to the promised land. Okay, chapter 14. I have to tell you, I know how you feel if you're thinking that this verse refers to Lucifer's fall from heaven. Because I felt that way. And what I found out from this study is that this verse is not referring to Satan or Lucifer at all. The contents of Isaiah 14:12 are sandwiched in between chapter 13, talking about Babylon will fall to the Medes, and the judgment on Assyria and Philistia. The text of Isaiah 14:12 and following mentions ascending to heaven, raised above God. It's talking about the pride of the Babylonians. You remember back to Genesis in chapter 11, the Tower of Babel? Well, the Tower of Babel was in Babylon, and it was Babylonians. Okay, that's what that's about. It demonstrates their ambition to build high enough to basically be God. That was their ambition. So God knocked them down a notch and confused their language. And they were not able to accomplish their ambition. No one has ever ascended to heaven but he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. That's from John 3:13. So who's fallen from heaven? This is the man who made the earth tremble and shook kingdoms, who overthrew cities, who did not allow his prisoners to go home. That's from Isaiah chapter 14, verse 16 and 17. Babylon is identified also in verse 22. It's the king of Babylon. It was Belshazzar, who's also mentioned over in Daniel chapter 5. That's who I believe Isaiah 14 is talking about after doing this study. Any thought on that? Anybody ever hear the notion that it may have been Lucifer that was thrown down? Because that kind of seemed to fit for me until I started to study this, and I thought, Isaiah is talking about what he's talking about. He's been talking about Babylon. Okay, judgment on Assyria. The Lord of hosts has sworn, saying, surely, just as I have intended, so it has happened. And just as I have planned, so it will stand, to break Assyria in my in my land. I will trample on him, on my mountain. Then his yoke will be removed from them and his burden removed from their shoulders. So this great expansion was really at God's behest. The problem was with the Assyrians and the Babylonians both is that neither one of them neither recognized that God gave them the success, nor did they give him honor or thanks. They were either thankful, nor did they honor God. That reminds me of one of Ken's favorite chapters, Romans chapter 1. Once those two things happen, once you refuse to honor God as God and nor give him thanks, if you read Romans 1, there's a progression. It's a downward spiral to depravity, a depraved mind, and total destruction. Because they wouldn't honor God as God, even though what was been created is more than enough evidence, nor were they thankful. Instead, they're arrogant and prideful, boastful. Okay, judgment on Philistia. In the year of King Ahaz, in the year he died, this oracle came. Do not rejoice, O Philistia, all of you, because the rod that struck you is broken. He's talking about the Assyrian Medo kingdom expansion. That's been broken. He says, don't rejoice over that. For from the serpent's fruit a viper will come out, and its fruit will be a flying serpent. Those who are most helpless will eat, and the needy will lie down in security. I will destroy your root with famine, and it will kill all of your survivors. Wail, O gates, cry, O city, melt away, O Philistia, all of you, for smoke comes from the north, and there is no slacker in their ranks. How then will I answer the message of the nations? The Lord has founded Zion, and the afflicted of his people will seek refuge in it. Okay, this prophecy is dated the year of King Ahaz's death. Philistia had been a perpetual enemy of Israel and his God's people. Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar II, invaded Philistia in 604 BC and burned its towns and incorporated the territory into the Neo-Babylon Empire. Philistines disappeared from the record of history after that year. So this is the prophecy that has been fulfilled, remarkably fulfilled. And it comes from Isaiah chapter 14. Okay, let's see. See if I can get one more. Okay, application. Number one, Judah's corruption condemned. Woe to the wicked who call wrong right and right wrong. By the way, who are you following, supporting, endorsing, voting for? Is it humanism or is it Jehovah? It matters, folks. It matters. Every choice we have matters. And we need to reflect what we really believe and not make excuses for that if we're going to remain faithful to Jehovah. Number two, Judah's hope is in the branch from chapter 11. I really like that chapter because it's the only chapter of comfort, really, in this first series of chapters. A remnant, only those who draw out the fresh water are redeemed by the branch that are in the Messiah's kingdom, New Israel or Zion. And the third thing is judgment on the day of the Lord for the nations. The nations have all violated Jehovah's universal reign, his universal law. They've acted with pride, with arrogance, treachery, lack of honor, lack of thankfulness to the Creator. These are things that mark his adversaries. And he promises, the Lord does, Jehovah does, that he's going to avenge them for their behavior, for their choices. So it's really important which camp we're in. Okay, I want you to memorize these for next week, these verses up here. I think I try to count them. There's 33 or 34 verses in there, and they're probably too small for you to see even if you're fairly up close, but they're all from Isaiah, and they're pretty remarkable. Can you see any of them? Just a question. Say again? Oh, you could read 40:18 on the bottom right. To whom then will you liken God? Yeah. For a child will be born to us. Turn to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God, and there is no other. 45:22. Yeah. Have to turn this. He was crushed for our iniquities. Isaiah 53:5. Iniquity is taken away and sin is forgiven. Excellent. God's what? God is my salvation. Thank you for that, Michael. Thank you for that. A virgin will be with child and bear a son, and will call his name Emmanuel. 7:14. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. 6:3. Isaiah 41:4. I am the Lord, I am the first, I am the last, I am he. I read through all these, and there seemed to be a couple of themes, obviously, but one of the major themes I saw is that God, Jehovah, is making it really clear he's the only God. There is no other. And I think he gets a little upset when people invent other gods. He says he's a jealous God. In fact, that's one of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods. It's offensive. In fact, some people look at Christianity and go, yeah, I like that. I'll just add it to the bucket of other beliefs I have. That's not the way it works, is it? Once you accept Jesus, you have to forsake all others. Just like when you chose your spouse, you're making a commitment to forsake all others in that kind of a relationship, I mean. So I'll leave you with that, and thank you for your attendance. You got, I think, an extra minute to beat the kids to the donuts. Thanks for coming. God bless you.